around to Glenn's slide again.
And
and we are being live streamed, I see. So we'll stop sharing once we get to that slide. Say again that, or maybe I can actually click to speed it up a little. Get this to Glenn, maybe. No, I got to go back to get to Glenn, apparently. Oop, was. So I have known Glenn Branch for over 20 years now, 25 years maybe, which kind of blows my mind. I remember talking to him when I was visiting professor at Kalamazoo College in 1999 or 2000 or thereabouts about proposed climate change education and legislation in Michigan, which was unsuccessful. And it was, I think, unsuccessful partly because the National Center for Science Education helps us deal with stuff like that. Back then, it was focused on evolution. Now it's evolution and climate change. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Glenn and stop sharing my screen and let him start sharing his. And I have not kept up on the chat, but I will. So welcome one and all, and feel free to introduce yourself and say where you're from in the chat. And take it away, Glenn. And I'm going to pour myself a beer. And Glenn's on an unfamiliar computer, so it might take him a moment. There we are. Looking good.
Thanks for that introduction, Don, and it's good to be speaking to you today. As you see, I'm going to be speaking tonight about how kids are at risk from climate change denial, with a focus on the climate change denial propaganda campaigns of the past year, 2023. In my role as Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education, I spent a considerable amount of time with these campaigns. I've suffered for my art, and now it's your turn. I'll remind you that NCSC works with teachers, parents, scientists, and concerned citizens at the local, state, and national levels to ensure that socially but not scientifically controversial topics, such as evolution and climate change, are taught accurately, honestly, and confidently. And we mainly do this from Oakland, California, the other side of the country from New York. Hello, next slide, thank you. So it was good to see a few years ago a pair of bills introduced in the New York legislature that would establish a grant program to support teacher professional development with regard to a particular scientific topic. This is the Senate sponsor, Todd Kaminsky, and the Assembly sponsor, Linda Rosenthal. Now, Senate Bill 6837 and Assembly Bill 9831 would have supported science education on a single particular topic of all the possible topics there are in science education. Golly, was it the ideal gas law, or the typology of tectonic plate boundaries, or maybe the concept of trophic levels in ecology? Of course not. Instead, Kaminsky's and Rosenthal's bills were explicitly geared toward climate change education and climate change literacy. Indeed, they specified that the new law, were it to pass, would be called the New York Climate Change Education Act. And in a memorandum accompanying the bills, the sponsor offered a justification, which observed correctly that 97% of publishing climate scientists agree that humans are causing climate change, that is, the unprecedentedly rapid climate change detectable since the Industrial Revolution. Multiple independent studies using different methods have consistently produced estimates of the extent of scientific consensus on anthropomorphic climate change among climate scientists, converging in the neighborhood of 97%. That's a sentence I find myself repeating a lot, so let me say a bit about what's behind it. I'll give you two examples so you can get a sense of the different ways these estimates are produced. First, Peter Duran and Maggie Zimmerman sent a questionnaire to 10,000 plus Earth scientists asking about global warming and human activity, and the questionnaire got a decent 31% response rate. Not only did the responding scientists tend to agree that global warming is real and caused by human activity, But those who are the most familiar with climate science and those who published most on it in the scientific research literature tended to agree more. There was a clear relation between expertise and acceptance, visible in the left to right upward slope of the yes part of this graph and the left to right downward slope of the no part. A second, John Cook and his colleagues examined almost 12,000 abstracts of scientific papers on global climate change and global warming, published over a 20-year span, 1991 to 2011. This was a massive effort, which they crowdsourced, but with careful controls to ensure consistency and accuracy. They found that among the abstracts expressing a position on anthropogenic global warming, upwards of 97% endorsed it. Of the authors to express a position, upwards of 98% endorsed it. Vanishingly few abstracts and vanishingly few authors denied anthropomorphic global warming. Now, this consensus on climate change isn't a mere demographic artifact, it's significant. And the consensus on climate change is significant because it's the product of evidence. Evidence so abundant, diverse, and robust as to engender a consensus in the community of the scientific experts on climate. For that reason, the nation's leading scientific organizations, such as the National Academy of Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, have assessed, reported, and endorsed that consensus. And groups like the National Science Teaching Association have followed their lead, describing the science of climate change as firmly rooted in decades of peer-reviewed scientific literature and as sound and advanced as other established areas of geoscience. So, with such a robust consensus on anthropogenic climate change among climate scientists, the nation's leading scientific organizations, and the nation's leading science teaching organization, why would New York legislators see any need to propose support for teaching about it in New York's public schools? Is it because climate change education is unpopular? Nope. On the contrary, when the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication asks whether people support teaching about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to global warming, the numbers are really high nationwide, with 77% of respondents saying they strongly or somewhat support it. Different pollsters report similar results. But the thing is, despite the popular support for it in the abstract, climate change education in the United States is, not going to lie, not all that it could be. In the next few slides, I'm going to be discussing a rigorous national survey of climate education conducted in 2014 by NCSE, along with researchers from Penn State. Included in the survey were 1,500 public, middle, and high school science teachers from every state. It turns out that science teachers are conveying unwarranted doubt about the scientific consensus. 4 in 10 reported that they emphasized that many scientists believe that the recent increases in temperature are probably due to natural causes. A minority of those teachers emphasized only that claim, with the majority reporting that they also emphasize what is in fact the scientific consensus, that recent global warming is primarily caused by human release of greenhouse gases. Hence the title of the survey report, Mixed Messages. Moreover, a handful of teachers, 1 in 20, dodged the issue altogether, neither presenting nor disputing the scientific consensus on the cause of climate change. That leaves a majority, but only a slim majority, 54%, of teachers actually emphasizing only the scientific consensus on climate change. The failure of so many science teachers to emphasize the scientific consensus on climate change is evidently associated with their unawareness of the consensus. When we asked them to estimate the degree of scientific consensus on climate change among climate scientists, only 39% of them selected the correct quintile, 81 to 100%, outperforming the general public at 31%, but only by a little. And that, in turn, is probably due to the fact that these science teachers haven't had the opportunity to study climate change themselves. More than half of the teachers in the survey reported not having received any formal instruction on climate change as pre-service teachers. 7 out of 10 reported never having received any continuing education classes that deal with climate change. Commenting on the survey, the online satirical newspaper The Onion remarked, through its Vox Populi column, "It's so hard for teachers to know what's right, what with the overwhelming abundance of scientists saying the exact same thing." It doesn't help that teaching resources are often out of date, even on such basic facts as the scientific consensus on climate change. For example, a recent review of 6th grade science textbooks used in California found that the human contribution to climate change was presented as a possibility rather than a certainty. Adding to this problem is this complicated contrivance, the climate change denial machine, whereby powerful entities work through think tanks, front groups, and false grassroots, or AstroTurf, organizations to keep Americans in an echo chamber of climate denial, in which they only hear very biased messaging on climate change, if they hear anything about it at all. A key message in this echo chamber is denial of the scientific consensus of climate change, because that's exactly what's necessary to defer, delay, or derail action on climate change. An important cog of the climate change denial machine takes advantage of the weaknesses of American climate change education by trying to take their case directly to the classroom by disseminating propaganda to teachers and students. This slide shows a sampling of the materials that have historically been used in such campaigns. I'll now turn to discussing, in chronological order, the campaigns NCSE was tracking just last year. As we'll see, a major theme is attacking the existence of a robust scientific consensus on climate change. In February 2023, the Heartland Institute was in the headlines. This is from Grist, for sending 8,000 teachers across the country a booklet entitled Climate at a Glance, intended to provide them with, quote, the data to show that the Earth is not experiencing a climate crisis. As I told Grist, the supposed data was highly selective. They typically give a straightforward observation or statistic that's not in dispute and add some commentary that's wildly exaggerated or a completely false interpretation. I wish that I had thought of describing it the way that the sociologist Robert Brolla described it. He said, the 1990s called, they want their scientific misinformation back. This wasn't Heartland's first rodeo by any means. Heartland has repeatedly mailed unsolicited materials disputing the scientific consensus on climate change to teachers across the U.S. In 2017, they claimed to have mailed their booklet, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, to hundreds of thousands of teachers. Uptake was slim. The vast bulk of teachers promptly binned it. The best reaction, however, came from an elementary school student in Massachusetts. In any case, the small scale of Heartland's 2023 campaign, only 8,000 teachers as compared to hundreds of thousands, struck me as a tacit admission by Heartland that this is not a winning strategy for them. Like Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, Climate at a Glance takes on the scientific consensus, but in a different way from the earlier Heartland publication. It insists, without argument, that the only relevant data are from a 2016 survey of the American Meteorological Society, which is silly because not all AMS members are climate scientists and not all climate scientists are AMS members. It acknowledges that a majority of these scientists accept anthropogenic global warming, begrudgingly, since it's not just a majority, it was 2/3 of them, and it shifts the goalposts as to whether the AMS members are deeply concerned or not, as though meteorologists are the best people to consult about the effects of climate change on nature and society, as opposed to, say, the weather. I'm just going to digress a bit to give a similar example of the Heartland Institute's recent tendency to shift the goalposts on the scientific consensus on climate change, mainly because I found it inordinately amusing. In November 2022, Heartland put out a press release with the headline, 97% consensus on climate change. Survey shows only 59% of scientists expect a significant harm. The fun begins with Hartland's definition of scientists. As we saw, the various studies establishing the scientific consensus on climate change generally survey expert scientific opinion, either inspecting articles on climate change that appear in the peer-reviewed scientific research literature, or directly polling the authors of such articles, who typically have doctoral degrees in relevant areas of science. In the Hartland's Commission survey, however, although the respondents were required to have earned degrees in climatology, meteorology, physics, geology, or hydrology, the majority of them attained only a bachelor's degree. Only 6% had a PhD. Only 11% of the respondents reported that their professional activity was best described as research. So we're comparing here apples and oranges, a stack of apples that had a modicum of exposure in the past, the recent scientific research, with a tree full of oranges that's actually advancing our knowledge of climate change as we speak. And yet, even despite that mismatch, the survey report reveals that 96% of the respondents to the Hartland Commission survey accept that global climate change is occurring. Asked to estimate what percentage of climate change is due to human activity, 92% of the respondents said that most of it is. That is, they selected a value between 51 and 100%, averaging out at 75%. Well, 96%, 92%, these figures are, of course, not far from the iconic 97%. So once I had read the survey report, and then once I had finished laughing, I wrote a quick expose for DeSmog, which was published in the same month that Hartland's press release appeared. So that was a good day's work. As for the harms from climate change, since Hartland wasn't actually surveying experts, the fact that only 59% of its respondents agree that climate change will result in significant harm is neither here nor there. If you want an expert opinion on the harms from climate change, you can get one from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which in a 2022 report summarized that, quote, human-induced climate change, including more frequent and intense extreme events, has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people beyond natural climate variability. The IPCC's reports are produced with the input of leading scientists around the world and undergo rigorous and comprehensive review. They really do represent expert scientific opinion. But let's return to the theme of climate change denial aimed at kids. The CO2 Coalition took a different approach in March 2023. Instead of mailing propaganda to science teachers, it handed out propaganda to science teachers at the National Science Teaching Association's annual meeting. This, as you can tell from the headline in the Washington Post, did not go all that well for them. It was a little misleading for the Post headline to say that the CO2 Coalition was ejected, quote, for deceptive comic book. For one thing, the CO2's coalition representatives were handing out not one, but 3 comic books. All were deceptive, to be sure, and also atrociously drawn. And for another thing, the contract that the CO2 Coalition signed when they requested a booth at the conference certified that their materials were consistent with the NSTA's official positions, which include a position on the teaching of climate change, which, quote, acknowledges that decades of research and overwhelming scientific consensus indicate with increasing certainty that Earth's climate is changing, largely due to human-induced increases in the concentrations of heat-absorbing gases, such as, I don't know, carbon dioxide. The CO2 Coalition's materials were not only inconsistent with the NSTA's position statements, but actively at odds with them, since also distributed was a critique of the NSTA's position statement on climate change. One of the major themes of the critique was objecting to the NSTA's respect for the scientific consensus, which the CO2 Coalition was pleased to describe as promoting indoctrination. Clearly, this was not a good faith effort to engage the NSTA and its members. Rather, the CO2 Coalition was trying to pick a fight. Another campaign. In May 2023, Everbright Media, a company founded and fronted by former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, added to its Kids Guide series, The Kids Guide to the Truth About Climate Change. This was aimed at kids, not teachers, and indeed the kids of parents who wanted to inculcate their children with conservative Christian values and who weren't leery about incurring repeating and hard-to-cancel charges on their credit cards. But one reporter found a public school educator who used some kids' guides with her middle school students, suggesting that they do indeed find their way into classrooms sometimes. For me, it was simultaneously delightful and frustrating to discuss the kids' guides with reporters. And that's because the folks who wrote the Heartland Institute materials and the folks who wrote the CO2 Coalition materials knew enough about the science to misrepresent it effectively. It's tedious and unrewarding to explain how those materials are misleading. I have to give credit to Agence France Presse, which prepared a detailed fact check of Heartland's Climate at a Glance booklet, but I doubt that it had a lot of readers. But the folks who wrote the Kids Guide, in contrast, were just clueless. So I was able to tell Inside Climate News that this graph of carbon dioxide levels over the last 500,000 years or so from Vostok ice cores was just laughably wrong. The caption, maybe you can't read it, but the caption to the graph says, looking back in time, carbon dioxide levels have always gone up and down, up till the point on the graph marked as present day. I actually pulled the Vostok data myself and ascertained that the last data point shown here was from about 391 BC, about 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution, after which the vast majority of carbon dioxide emissions from human activity occurred. Today's CO2 atmospheric concentration is about 420 parts per million, which would not fit on the y-axis of this graph. So that was delightful. What was frustrating about criticizing the Kids Guide was that it was so target-rich an environment that I couldn't convince journalists to cover all the problems. I'll just mention what I think was the wackiest. Scientists, we are told, have found that huge underground fresh and saltwater oceans move the oceans we see and help drive the climate. Huge underground fresh and saltwater oceans, a fantasy worthy of Jules Verne. I actually think that I found a diagnosis of this particular error. Some relatively recent geological research from 2014 onward suggests that there might be a whole lot of water in Earth's mantle, which provoked headlines like this one from Quanta magazine in 2018. But if that's what the Kids Guide's authors were looking at, then they should have looked at the actual research or even finished reading the article, because they would have found that the water would be in the form of hydroxide contained in the crystal structure of minerals like wadsleyite and ringwoodite, and not, I repeat, not sloshing around in a subterranean ocean. Although the Kids Guide is laughably amateurish in its scientific content, as opposed to Heartland's and the CO2 Coalition's materials, though, it shares their denial of a scientific consensus. What you may not know, it states in its introduction, is that thousands of renowned scientists and weather experts worldwide have some very different opinions on climate change. One last campaign, or rather a series of them. In August 2023, news that material from PragerU Kids had been approved for use in Florida's public schools by the State Department of Education. PragerU Kids is honestly named in that the conservative talk show host Dennis Prager is at its helm, dishonestly named in that it is no kind of university. Rather, PragerU Kids produces conservative propaganda aimed at children, typically in the form of 5-minute videos and related comics, some involving climate change denial. Poland, Anya's energy crisis, is particularly noteworthy. Anya, a Polish teenager, is worried about climate change after learning about it at school. Her parents reassure her that the climate has always varied naturally, a standard climate change denial talking point. And they warn her that action on climate change would be pointless until China and India cut their emissions, and that renewable energy is unreliable and expensive. All these are also points made in the Kids Guide. But what really seals the deal for Anya is being inspired by her grandfather, who was in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, the largest single revolt by Jews against Nazi oppressors in World War II. This not very subtly invites the analogy. Climate change deniers are to climate change acceptors as Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto are to, yep, they went there. And like the other climate change denial propaganda we've seen, Anya's energy crisis denies the scientific consensus on climate change. It's rather weak sauce in this case. Anya's father, Timon, reads scientific journals and talks with researchers at his university, on the basis of which he provides the other side to Anya. This, in effect, denies the existence of a scientific consensus on climate change. Unlike Heartland and the CO2 Coalition, but like Everbright Media and its kids' guides, PragerU for Kids has a broad array of conservative propaganda for kids, not limited to climate change denial. Unlike Everbright Media, PragerU for Kids isn't being operated primarily to maximize profit, but to get its message into the classroom. And a series of savvy publicity moves in 2023 put it in the headlines in 5 states: New Hampshire, Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, and Montana. Lest we panic, though, it's important to consider what actually happened in these states and whether it is going to compromise the integrity of climate change education there. In New Hampshire, high school students now have the opportunity to satisfy a financial literacy graduation requirement with PragerU's Kids Cash Course module online. The commissioner of the State Department of Education, Frank Edelblut, a Republican, even appeared in a promotion for it. Whatever you think about this, it's not likely to have any effect on climate change education. In Texas, a PragerU promotion that featured praise from Julie Pickren, a Republican member of the State Board of Education, claimed that PragerU is an approved education vendor in the state. That was not, and it still is not, actually true. Texas has a lot of problems with climate change education, thanks in part to Pickren, but official approval of PragerU for Kids materials is not among them. In Montana, the state superintendent of public instruction, Elsie Artson, a Republican, signed a textbook license agreement with PragerU. This doesn't have much actual significance because the only requirement for obtaining such a license is posting a surety bond, in PragerU's case for $5,000. Having the license doesn't mean that instructional materials will be considered, let alone approved, and the superintendent doesn't make decisions on instructional materials anyhow. But Arntzen did express her approval of the materials, which might conceivably have some effect on districts' purchasing decisions. In Oklahoma, the State Department of Education, under State Superintendent of Public Instruction Ryan Walters, a Republican, announced a partnership with PragerU, which seems to take the form of the department endorsing its videos for use in social studies classrooms. While there are, in general, opportunities to discuss climate change in social studies classes, Oklahoma's social studies standards don't provide a lot of opportunities, so the effect on climate education will probably be limited. The Oklahoma Education Association reacted to Walter's announcement by reminding districts that they don't have to use the material and parents that they could opt their children out of exposure to them. And in Florida, where we started, the State Department of Education under Commissioner Manny Diaz Jr., a Republican, approved a number of PragerU for Kids videos for use in social studies classrooms for younger students. There's no plausible reason to use Prager's climate change denying videos in these classes, though, because climate change isn't in Florida's lower grade social studies standards. Moreover, decisions about instructional materials in Florida are typically made at the district level without reference to the edicts of the State Department of Education. Several of the larger districts have already announced that they would not be approving PragerU videos for classroom use. I'm afraid I rather disappointed a reporter for Politico in predicting that the Florida Department of Education's approval of the videos would have little effect on climate education. Although, as you can see, that didn't discourage the headline writer. The farthest I was willing to go was to say first that the state's approval in effect publicizes these videos to sympathetic teachers, and second, that even teachers who want to teach climate change accurately might feel coerced to do otherwise. With the state's imprimatur of the PragerU videos, there's a risk that people are going to be pressuring teachers into using them. But there's been so far no significant evidence of significant uptake from teachers or pressures on teachers in Florida. In general, then, PragerU actually hasn't gained a lot of ground. It received a lot of attention thanks to Republican sympathizers in those 5 states, but no evidence of significant classroom uptake. And there's reason to believe that even if there were such uptake, it wouldn't substantially affect climate change education in particular. But the trend is certainly disturbing, and we'll have to keep our eyes on PragerU in the coming years. And in general, I think there's reason to think that climate change denial propagandas aimed at teachers and students are unlikely to have a lot of success. The child's garden of climate change denial is not particularly fertile. Apologies to Robert Louis Stevenson. There are 3 reasons for this. First, just as a general matter, public school teachers are not in the habit of teaching out of random unsolicited stuff they receive in the mail or are handed at conferences or stumble across on the internet. Sometimes their districts don't allow them to use unapproved materials, but whether or not they're allowed to, it's going to be rare. Second, the climate change denial propaganda we've looked at today is basically devised with complete inattention to the needs of today's teachers. They're not keyed to state science standards. They don't provide lesson plans and so on. As a general matter, if you want teachers to use your materials in their classrooms, you have to make it easy for them to do so. You can't mark them some assembly required and hope for the best. And third, climate science teachers tend to accept anthropogenic climate change themselves and to understand that it's the consensus of the scientific community, and their rate of acceptance is improving. For example, between 2014 and 2019, the proportion of middle school science teachers saying that they think that global warming is caused mostly by human activities rose from 67 to 76%, a rise of 9 percentage points. The proportion correctly thinking that between 81 and 100% of teachers think that, scientists think that global warming is caused by humans rose from 30% to 45%. A rise of 14 percentage points, not 15 because I'm rounding. High school science teachers do better than middle school teachers, unsurprisingly. So the audience of teachers who are sympathetic to climate change denial propaganda materials is dwindling. Teachers are eager to teach climate change in general. They just need the resources to do so effectively, which includes preparation, both in terms of content knowledge and pedagogical know-how. A few right-wing outlets have drawn the inference that in the absence of adequate preparation, teachers should just teach all views, adopt a relatively balanced approach, as this guy says, apparently on the grounds that it's impossible for science teachers to acquire new knowledge and skills, as if teachers, like other professionals, such as doctors and lawyers, aren't routinely expected to do so. 4 states, to their credit, have recognized the need to prepare their science educators to teach climate change effectively and have allocated funds for the purpose. Good job, Washington, California, Maine, and New Jersey. Legislation to the same effect has been introduced in a handful of other states, although not successfully yet. A big influence on whether science teachers are discussing climate change is state science standards. These are documents indicating what knowledge and know-how students are expected to acquire in the course of their science education in their state. So standards play a big, although not a decisive, role in classroom education, since teacher preparation, textbook content, and statewide testing all follow state science standards. So in 2020, NCSC and the Texas Freedom Network Education Fund conducted a study of the treatment of climate change in state science standards, citing letter grades to each state. A bare majority of states, 27, including New York, received a grade of B+ or better. Here too, there's progress. If we conducted the study again today, we'd be up to 29 states with a grade of B+ or better, thanks to substantial improvements in Indiana and South Carolina. But we still need to do better because climate change is homeless in American education. Oh, sure, you can talk about how species cope or fail to cope with climate change in high school biology. You can talk about ocean acidification in high school chemistry. You can talk about the greenhouse effect itself in high school physics. But the most natural place to teach and to learn about climate change in secondary education is a high school level earth science or environmental science class. Owing to decisions made more than a century ago, high school level earth science and environmental science classes are thin on the ground. Data on this are sparse and out of date, but probably less than a quarter of high school students take an earth science class. As of 2018, only 8 states, including New York, require studying earth science concepts at the high school level. Only 2 require taking an earth science course in order to graduate from high school. But these are exactly the kinds of courses in which it would be most natural to study climate change intensively. Earth science class is the most natural place to study climate change comprehensively and in detail. If nothing else changes in the educational system, then the vast majority of future American adults will have at best a middle school level understanding of climate change, which is no kind of a way to prepare today's students to cope with the challenges of tomorrow's warmer world. Things are changing in the educational system, although slowly and completely unevenly. Climate change is now a staple of earth science, even though earth science is still neglected, and aspects of climate change are increasingly incorporated in other types of science classes, especially biology. In the next generation science standards used in 20 states plus the District of Columbia, there are multiple climate change hooks in high school biology, a class that almost every graduating student takes. I should add that science classes are not the only place where climate change education should be happening. Social studies classes, especially geography classes, are perhaps the most natural venue for climate change education outside the sciences. In 2020, the Aspen Institute found that 5 states require the study of climate change through their social studies standards, with 12 more including it. There's been some legislation in various states, including New York, to add climate change to social studies standards, although no successes thus far. Even more impressively, in 2020, thanks to the advocacy of the First Lady of New Jersey, Tammy Murphy, climate change was incorporated into all the state's education standards. All of them, every single one. Science, social studies, mathematics, home ec, phys ed. If you're taking a course in German in a Garden State classroom, you're now expected to acquire the vocabulary to have a conversation about Klimawandel, climate change, auf Deutsch. So there are signs of progress, but don't expect massive change overnight. I like to tell people that science education in the United States is more like a freight train than a Ferrari. It's expensive, even more so than a Ferrari. It's made up of a lot of loosely linked components. There are 13,500 local school districts with primary responsibility over curriculum and instruction, and it takes a long time to change directions. So progress is always going to be slow, uneven, and incremental, but the National Center for Science Education, where I work, is in there swinging. NCSC is doing its part to support climate change education in 3 main ways. First, of course, NCSC acts as a crisis clinic for those facing threats to climate change education, as well as evolution education, in their schools, districts, and states. This can involve anything from one-on-one coaching of teachers, students, and parents, to organizing broad coalitions to respond to such threats at a statewide level. In addition to monitoring and working against bills that would harm science education, NCSC also does a bit to monitor and support bills that would aid science education, especially climate change education. So, for example, I was interviewed by the New York Times in January 2024 about climate change education, including those in New York. While the 2019 New York bills that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk did not pass, activists there have continued their efforts. So when I was talking to the Times, I made a point to plug what have emerged as the leading proposals, Senate Bill 278 and Assembly Bill 1559. If you haven't told your legislatures that you support these bills, why don't you do that right after the Q&A? Second, NCSC has been conducting research on climate change education intermittently for years, including 2 national surveys of science teachers about climate change and a recent study of climate change in state science standards. Where do you think I get all those wonderful graphs? And we've recently decided to start doing this work regularly with a review of textbooks in 2023 and another national survey of science educators launched this year. Third, NCSC has a program aimed at preparing teachers to effectively teach socially but not scientifically controversial topics, such as evolution and climate change, coordinating high-quality program for pre-service and in-service teachers across the country. All of which I make so bold as to suggest is a good reason to think of NCSC when you're considering where to direct your charitable donations. We couldn't do all this important work without the generous support of people like you. In any case, one of my favorite parts of the job is the chance to discuss the obstacles to science education and the ways of overcoming them with folks like you. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Glenn. That was great.
I will unshare my screen.
And I'm going to open it up for questions. You can either raise your hand by going like this, or you can use the reactions button in Zoom, or you can put it in the chat. Cindy, go ahead.
Recognize people. Yeah, thanks.
So much, Glenn. That was incredibly informative. So I just came back, as maybe Don has, from going to Albany in New York, our capital, to talk with legislators about climate justice, energy bills, and climate change education. And a very supportive person, my representative, Anna Kellis, she mentioned, which we've talked about, the necessity before the legislature could even vote on it and hope to vote on it would be to get the union support and the New York State Department of Education. I know people are working on that, but I wonder if you in your research know where that is, because that's kind of a pushback from the legislators. Well, we don't have that and we need that before we can take any legislative action.
Don Haas might be in a better position to answer that. My impression is that the State Department of Education is now in the loop and that they do favor efforts to improve climate change education, although they aren't necessarily 100% behind the approach in that legislation. The union.
Go ahead.
Done. And I believe that there's some interest among the unions, but I'm not sure whether they've formally endorsed these bills.
Yeah, so I can say a bit about both of that. And for one thing, I'm hoping that your conversation with Kellis's staff was before mine, because I think they learned a little bit from talking to me yesterday afternoon. And the question of the state education department, they are now, it's a very interesting situation where I think all constituencies want to improve climate change education in New York State in K-12 schools. And virtually everyone we've talked to, and yesterday was my third lobbying trip around the bill, virtually everyone we've talked to, which is legislators, members of the Board of Regents, and staff at the State Education Department, want to improve climate change education, and yet it's difficult to make happen. But I will note that the conversations with folks at the State Education Department have been quite a bit more recent. We tried to talk to them earlier and didn't get much traction. And I think we are now have their attention because legislators are talking to them about our bill, because we've been lobbying for it for a while. And so we had a meeting on February 29th and another one on March 8th, which unfortunately is very late in the legislative process in New York State. So I don't think it's going to trickle down to affect the outcome of the bill this year. But state education department very clearly does want to improve climate change education in the state. I think they don't want to do it legislatively, and they would rather have it done with them getting an appropriation and doing it internally without change in law, which is fine as long as it works. We are going to continue to advocate for the bill until we either pass the bill or have something that is satisfactory in another way. And it's interesting to note that, New Jersey did it non-legislatively. I believe California did it legislatively, and I think Washington also, both New Jersey and Washington, I believe, were efforts out of the governor's office and were non-legislative. And either way works as long as it works. And we are making progress. We do have some union support. I'll see if I can find the cover story from November from UFT's member magazine that talked about the bill and was indeed supportive. We do have a letter of support from UUP, the university union. We don't have letters of support from teachers unions as yet, but hopefully we'll get those soon. And I'm also going to turn off my camera for a minute while I turn on more light because it's getting dark. And other questions before I turn off my camera for a moment? Karen looks like she's got something on the tip of her tongue. Maybe not.
Glenn, I was really interested in your comments about the state standards. And I'm wondering the degree to which you have evidence about teachers using state standards in their work.
Well, it's
And
not as
I
though-
ask that as a bit of a skeptic, having spent my lifetime working on implementation of standards.
Yeah, well, it's definitely true that teachers don't wake up, get out of bed, consult the standards, and head into the classroom. So the influence they have is not day to day and it's not direct. But we do find evidence that standards do make a difference. We have the Penn State guys and NCSE have a paper coming out later this year in Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education. It's a special issue on climate change education. And we actually show improvements in climate change education at the middle school level between 2014 and 2019, some of which seems we have a statistical analysis showing that some of that is apparently due to improvements in standards. And a lot of it is due to improvement in the middle school teachers' awareness of scientific consensus on climate change, actually. We also have evidence from other areas of science education because we know from other survey work there were substantial gains in evolution education between 2007 and 2019, and these were the strongest in NGSS states, which, of course, treat evolution as a central organizing principle of biology. So the influence of standards is real, even though it isn't direct and day-to-day.
Thank you.
Oh, and I'm just typing into the chat that NGSS is Next Generation Science Standards, which are essentially national standards. They are not federal standards, but national standards.
Right. New York standards are not NGSS, but they are based on the same framework that NGSS are based on.
They're about 97% NGSS.
So very comparable.
Yeah.
A little better here and there, I would say.
Other questions? Had some, they had left out of my brain, probably because I'm tired from driving to Albany yesterday. And Debbie put a comment in the chat. The Hannah and Rubart article 2020 shows that teachers who work in states with climate change in their standards teach it more often and with a consensus-based approach. Yeah, and I'll note that on New York standards, New York has end of course science exams at the high school level. And if content is in the exam, teachers generally try and teach it because they get in trouble if their kids don't do well on the exams. Right now, the content about climate change is almost exclusively limited to the earth science exam, and it's probably on the order of 1% in the average year. Sometimes there might be a cluster question that means that there's a set of data or a paragraph or something like that with information within it that might make the climate change as much as 5% of the exam, but I think that's unusual. And I will note a little bit off topic that I got a direct message asking if the museum has eclipse glasses, and we do. So stop by and get your eclipse glasses at the gift shop. Other questions?
I just want to add that I really appreciate your sense of humor, Glenn, and
Yes.
I understand how you can sustain the effort.
Thanks very much.
Yes, yes, and the eclipse glasses are also available at the Science Center. So we have them in our gift shop, and I'm actually in Western New York in Buffalo, and the Buffalo Museum of Science has distributed almost all of their 300,000 pairs of glasses in collaboration with the library system. But I think you can still get them at libraries or at the Buffalo Museum of Science, and they are closed on Eclipse Day because they had 3,000 people show up for the 2017 eclipse, which was not a total eclipse, and they were a little overwhelmed, and so they have done their best to prepare people to watch it at home this year. And maybe we will wrap it up. Thanks so much, Glenn. That was a great talk, and good luck on your move and your car issues.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Glenn.
Yes, and I'm going to put the Eclipse blog post in the link again, because that's going to happen between now and the next time we are together. And 2 weeks from tonight, we'll have Warren Allman talking about the importance of knowing about Antarctica and talking about his recent visit there. I think it was January and February when Warren was in Antarctica. So get your eclipse glasses and head out and see the eclipse. And
Yes.
put that
Don't
in.
miss it.
Don't miss it. And if you think you've seen a total solar eclipse before, you're wrong, because you would know.
That's right. It's an exceptional experience.
Is an exceptional experience. Nothing quite like a total solar eclipse. So thank you all, and thank you especially to Glenn. And we will see folks again in a couple of weeks. Have a good night.
You're going.